How's it going, everyone? This is Imperium Magistrate, and today I'm responding to the YouTuber Vlogging Through History. Vlogging Through History, or Chris, is a YouTuber who primarily focuses on making reaction videos. And a while ago, he did a reaction to the YouTuber Razorfist on his video of Abraham Lincoln. And more recently, he reacted to his video responding to Nikki Haley's comments about the Civil War. To summarize, Chris believes that Razorfist misrepresents and misinterprets various facts and aspects about Lincoln and the Civil War. He essentially promotes the usual narrative that Lincoln was a great statesman who sought to end slavery at all costs. Now, at face value, I feel most people would think Chris is more reliable than Razorfist. After all, Chris says he's a historian, whereas Razorfist looks like a cross between Alice Cooper and Bret the Hitman Hart. So why wouldn't you believe a historian over a YouTuber who makes rants about video games and culture? Well, there's only one problem, and that is that Chris is in fact not a historian, despite labeling himself as one. In other videos, he has admitted that his profession is in fact a genealogist, and he has one self-published book about a English peasant family who moves to America. How fascinating. Chris himself, in his old YouTube description, which he has since changed, had admitted that he had never worked in the field of history and only had a bachelor's degree. Now, I'm not going to go into specifics of what would qualify a historian since it's a very broad term, but I feel most people would want an expert of history to be something a little more than just a bachelor's degree. After all, if having a bachelor's degree is all you need to be a historian, then that would make the likes of Grant Hill, Sacha Baron Cohen, and myself as so-called historians. I have two major problems with Chris's video. The first problem is padding. Razor's video is roughly 13 minutes long, whereas Chris's video is 40 minutes long. I also want to point out that he criticized Razorfist's video on Lincoln for being too long, saying that if you need an hour to make your point, then you don't have a very good point. Yet despite this, he made essentially a 2-hour response to Razor's video. Instead of just editing it down, he makes the excuse that because the video was long, he himself had to make a long video. And even here, he takes a 13-minute long video and extends it to 40 minutes, oftentimes going on tangents about things that are irrelevant or extremely minor. One example of this is when Razorfist accidentally mixes up the 14th and 13th Amendments. It's pretty clear Razor just misspoke, and yet despite this, Chris goes on a tangent about what the 14th Amendment actually did. None of it related to Razor's point, so there was no reason to include this, yet Chris did. The second problem is that Chris often makes claims as if he has authority, and yet provides either no evidence or unsubstantiated evidence. And as I will show, most of these claims end up being false or misleading. I also want to point out the sheer hypocrisy of Chris, who says at the beginning that there's no reason to insult people and that we should have reasonable discussions over different opinions. Yet both in this video and on his social media, he throws insults regularly at anyone who disagrees with him, claiming that they are using mental gymnastics or are essentially delusional. But moving on to the main point of the video, the first problem he gives is when he tries to prove to Razor that secession was primarily about slavery. Following that, Chris pulls up what appears to be a website which essentially tries to summarize the Confederate causes as being primarily about slavery based on their secession documents. He then pulls up a chart which supposedly proves that every issue South Carolina cited was about slavery, with no mentions of issues of expansion of the United States, states' rights, industry versus farming, tariffs, or other reasons. I will go over why this chart is completely misleading, and why the majority of the South Carolina document was in fact about states' rights. But something we must first understand is that a constitutional violation can in fact relate to slavery, but that does not mean that the concern is over slavery. To quote Alexander Stevens, slavery was the occasion of secession, but not the primary cause. In other words, the real issue was constitutional violations. Yes, the constitutional violations were about slavery, But that does not mean the issue was with slavery itself or its legality. The issue was the South opposing the expansion of the federal government. The South Carolina secession document states the following: in the present case, that fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused, for years past, to fulfill their constitutional obligations, and we refer to their own statutes for proof. The Constitution of the United States, in its fourth article, provides as follows: no person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This stipulation was so material to the compact that without it the compact would not have been made. The greater number of the contracting parties held slaves, and they had previously evinced their estimate of the value of such a stipulation by making it a condition in the ordinance for the government of the territory ceded by Virginia, which now composed the states north of the Ohio River. The same article of the Constitution stipulates also for rendition by the states of fugitives from justice from the other states. Essentially, what this paragraph is saying is that the North had violated the Constitution with their liberty laws. The Constitution in Article 4 stated that all states must return runaway slaves, just as the Constitution also says that all states must return fugitives of other states. As we can see, South Carolina does mention constitutional violations as a cause for secession, which the founders believed were justified. Yes, the violations relate to slavery, but it is still about the Constitution being violated, and thus the compact is broken. I also find it interesting the chart Chris shows has a note stating, if a cause given is nominal about states' rights or expansion, but only in the context of how those things impact slavery, it is deemed to be about slavery. This is completely dishonest, as it ignores the constitutional violations, which was the real crux of the issue. Yes, these violations do relate to slavery, but that is irrelevant. The North agreed to these demands, and yet they violated the Constitution, which thus justifies secession. In a similar vein, Chris's chart claims that the line in Mississippi's document nullified the fugitive slave laws in almost every free state is about slavery, but again, in reality, it is about constitutional violations. If a state violates the Constitution, then that is basis for secession. We also know this from the Hartford Convention, in which northern states argued secession because they believed that the embargo on England, which hurt northern ports, was a violation of the constitutional compact, and thus was grounds for secession. What Chris is doing is dishonest, claiming that constitutional violations about slavery therefore meant secession was about slavery itself. It wasn't. Again, slavery was the occasion that caused secession, but it was not the root of the problem, which was the argument of federal power. What's even more baffling is Chris tries to make the argument that it was the southern states that wanted to violate federalism, not the North.
And it wasn't even about states' rights, and I'll tell you why. Because they wanted their laws concerning slavery to be enforced in the North, too. They even said that in their secession documents, that it wasn't enough even that they had slavery. They wanted the North to enforce their rules about slavery, too. So they wanted to not only defend their institution, they wanted to take away the states' rights of places like Ohio to do the same.
And ironically, the Constitution completely disproves this. Chris's claim that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 violated states' rights shows that Chris either doesn't understand the states' rights argument or is being disingenuous. Let me ask you something. Can a state print money? Can a state regulate commerce? can a state make treaties with foreign nations? The answer to all of these things is no. States don't have the right to do that because the Constitution says so. States' rights does not mean states have unlimited power and that the federal government has no power. What it simply means is that what powers that are not directly delegated to the federal government are instead delegated to the states. Allowing fugitive slaves to become freedmen is not one of the powers of the states. As mentioned by South Carolina's document, Article 4 expressly says it is the constitutional obligation of the federal government to return all runaway slaves. And in fact, the supposed pro-slavery Tawney Court in a way weakened this clause. In Priggs v. Pennsylvania, in a unanimous ruling, the court declared that while states could not declare runaway slaves as freed, it did state that the states in question did not have to provide any federal aid to slave catchers. This did anger many planters, as they felt it violated what the Constitution says, and certainly the wording is ambiguous, but the point remains that all states were required by the Constitution to either return runaway slaves or not prohibit slave catchers sent by the federal government to return said slaves. Chris's entire argument that the South did not care about states' rights because of the Fugitive Slave Act completely crumbles when you know this. On top of that, he frames it as if the South forced the North into agreeing to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, yet there were more northern states than southern states, and they had a much bigger population in 1850. If every single northern politician simply voted against the Fugitive Slave Act, then it would have died, but it didn't. So the North was complicit in the passing of the act. So it was not forced upon them. They willingly agreed to the new law. Chris then brings the next old tired argument up that the Confederate government made it illegal for states to abolish slavery. This is completely false, and it's a falsehood that continues to be propagated to this day, even by academics. The misunderstanding comes from Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 of the Confederate Constitution, which states, "No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right to property in Negro slaves shall be passed." Many then assume that this made it impossible for any Confederate state to abolish slavery, unlike the North. Yet this is untrue, because like the United States Constitution, the Confederate Constitution was broken up into two parts. One which stated what the federal government could not do, and the other which stated what states could not do. Just a little down further, in Section 10, it states what the states in question shall not be allowed to do, such as coin money or pass any bill of attainder impairing the obligation of contracts. One thing that's not mentioned is passing a bill that would allow them to abolish slavery. In other words, Confederate states could abolish slavery if they so chose. And in fact, the governor of Virginia personally wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis stating that he would do everything he could to abolish slavery in Virginia if it meant gaining support from Europeans. So Chris is either ignorant of what the Confederate Constitution says, or is again being disingenuous. It's hard to tell with him. Chris then makes the insane argument that the reason the South voted against the Cornwall Amendment is because it did not protect slavery in the Western territories, which would have allowed more free states to come in and eventually abolish slavery through a new constitutional amendment. This argument is completely absurd and not based in reality. First of all, virtually no Southerner was under any delusion that slavery would last forever. And second, just because slavery was allowed in the West didn't mean that they would become prominent slave states or have enough slaves to where they would want to keep them legal. In fact, not only did Jefferson Davis note that the Western territories were poor climates for slave plantations, but even some Northerners were willing to admit the same. Daniel Webster, a prominent New England senator who was against slavery, noted that a ban on slavery in the Western territories was not only unconstitutional, but unnecessary, because, as he put it, I would not take pains to reaffirm an ordinance of nature, nor to reenact the will of God. In other words, because of the climate of the Southwest, it would be unlikely large slave plantations or farms would take hold there, and thus none of these states would truly become dependent on slavery like the South was. So no, the South didn't reject the Corwin Amendment because they wanted to expand slavery to all 50 states. They rejected the Corwin Amendment because it did not address the issues of constitutional federal power. It did not address any of the problems
themselves without the say-so of the federal fucking government. A fact the Confederate Constitution ties a great big bow on by outright banning protective tariffs of any kind. Hell, half the time...
Well, nobody's arguing that the South had a problem with tariffs. That's absolutely the case. They didn't secede over tariffs. Tariffs aren't mentioned once in any of those secession documents. They're not.
No mention of tariffs, huh? This is from Georgia's secession document. The material prosperity of the North was greatly dependent on the federal government. That of the South, not at all. In the first years of the Republic, the navigating, commercial, and manufacturing interests of the North began to seek profit and aggrandizement at the expense of the agricultural interests. Even the owners of fishing smacks sought to obtain bounties for pursuing their own business, which yet continue, and $500,000 is now paid to them annually out of the Treasury. The navigating interests beg for protection against foreign shipbuilders and against competition in the coasting trade. So clearly, this was referring to federal power and, in a way, tariffs that were used to prop up northern prosperity at the expense of the southern agrarians. So again, to imply that these documents made no mention of economics or tariffs, or to try to limit it simply to those exact words, is again dishonest.
Clear he put considerable time into crafting. If the South will consent to return to the Union, he argues, then if for no other reason than sheer force of numbers, the 14th Amendment would be mathematically guaranteed to fail to pass. I repeat, if Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, got his way in this meeting with the Confederate Peace Commission, not a single slave would have been freed.
That's not true, because by the time he met with this peace commission, again, we're talking about the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was already being ratified in enough southern states that it was going to be passed. Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas were already working to pass it. So I'm not sure what he's getting at here, because that is absolutely not true. First of all, he's talking about the wrong amendment. Second of all, the votes were there. Even if all of the southern states were readmitted to the Union, there were enough southern states that were going to ratify the 13th Amendment that it was going to become law regardless.
Chris's rant is particularly ironic because he unknowingly contradicts Lincoln's own words. At the Hampton Roads Conference, Lincoln told the Confederate diplomats that if they were to end the war and rejoin the Union, that they could vote against the 13th Amendment and secure slavery. Chris also acts as if the 13th was an inevitability, but David Donald, in his book on Lincoln, noted that the passage of the 13th was extremely difficult, and Lincoln did very little to convince delegates to approve of it. In other words, the great emancipator was more than willing to compromise on the issue of slavery and maintain its legality for upwards of 20 years to secure the Union. Yet Chris denies the primary source evidence of this and simply dismisses it. It seems like he got his history from Spielberg's Lincoln rather than actual historical documents.
In the Honest Abe myth, half-assedly attempted to prove Lincoln was only vaguely aware of the Corwin Amendment.
Doris Kearns Goodwin has more knowledge of actual history in her little pinky than you or I will ever have in our entire lifetimes.
Ah yes, petty insults. Didn't Chris criticize Razorfist for throwing insults at the start of the video? Ultimately, Chris adds nothing new to the discussion, and despite showing no real evidence, many of his viewers take him at face value simply because he calls himself a historian, which he is not. Ah yes, petty insults. Didn't Razor criticize... Ah yes, petty insults. Didn't Chris criticize Razorfist for throwing insults at the start of the video? In conclusion, it is pretty clear that Chris does not think critically about the Civil War and instead simply regurgitates the tired arguments used in popular history books. It seems unlikely that he has critically read or analyzed any of the primary source documents, and seems to assume that if the word slave is mentioned anywhere, that's proof they seceded over slavery. As another example, he claimed that Virginia's document proved that they seceded over slavery, and yet the only time they use the word slave is by saying the slave-holding states. The rest of the document is about saying that they seceded over the federal government's invasion of the South. But according to Chris, because they used the term slave-holding South, which everyone used at the time, that means they seceded over slavery. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.